Métis nationhood issues, as well as Métis Nation citizenship and identity, stuff very close to my heart. Something, and it's, you know, this phenomenon that has been happening across Canada is something that I've been following for several years now. Maybe not quite as long as Professor Leroux, but it's something that's popped up, and it's something that I thought was serious and something that needed to be looked at. So we're very happy to welcome Professor Leroux here. But before I introduce him, and there's a really long CV here that I have to go through, but I just wanted to give a shout out to our national president, President Clem Chartier, who's here with us today. President Chartier is also and has been for his entire career a champion of the Métis Nation and the idea of who we are as Métis Nation citizens. So I'll get right to it here, and I'm probably going to miss a few things, but I think you're here to listen to Professor Leroux and not to me. Darryl Leroux is a descendant of some of the first French settlers on Turtle Island, who is committed to explaining and intervening in ongoing forms of French settler colonialism. He is an associate professor in the Department of Social Justice and Community Studies at St. Mary's University in, I'll have to go with this, Mi'kmaq territory. He's published his research on race shifting among French descendants in critical ethnic studies with Adam Beaudry at Social Studies of Science and Maisonneuve magazine. His book, Distorted Descent, White Claims to Indigenous Identity, will be available in September 2019, and I think he's even here to talk to his publishers today about what's going on with that. So we're very happy to, the Manitoba Métis Federation is very happy to be a part of this. In fact, I think we're going to have a little discussion afterwards between Professor Leroux and the MMF on the data, on the findings, on the research that he's done, and how he's going to be willing to share with the Métis government here in Manitoba and the Métis government across the homeland. So with that being said, let's please welcome Professor Leroux.
Hi everyone. So I'm Darryl, and I'm going to present some of my research. In particular, what I'm going to do today is go into some of the ways in which what I call the race shifting movement, some people call it the Eastern Métis movement, how it works on a genealogical level. So we're kind of going to get into stuff around ancestry, lineage, descent. And if you're someone who's familiar with genealogy, you might kind of grasp some of that. I'm going to try to make it as clear as possible in terms of how this sort of movement relies on long ago ancestors, primarily from the 1600s, to shift into an Indigenous identity today, often to oppose actual Indigenous people. So before I continue, I just want to be clear that my research isn't on individuals who've been impacted by a variety of different policies and laws, like residential schools, the Indian Act, and other child welfare policies, the 60s scoop, even sort of child incarceration, so people who are removed from their family. That's something that there's a long history of, and it continues into today here in Canada. It's something that I think many of us need to be aware of and continue to intervene in a number of ways, especially taking the lead from Indigenous peoples. But my research isn't really about people who were disconnected from their families and communities through those processes. My research is really about people like me, who are descended from some of the earliest French settlers in New France, who are now turning to genealogical records to claim an Indigenous identity based on an ancestor in the 1600s, which is a very different time period and a very different sort of movement than what a lot of people experience when it comes to disconnection. So I want to be clear about that, and I'm willing to take questions, obviously, about anything that I discuss today. I'm very happy to talk about it. So, first what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how DNA ancestry testing is factoring into some of the genealogical claims by giving a very specific example. And these are two examples that I'm going to be discussing today that I write about in my upcoming book that's coming out in September. So the first example is of a French woman named Katherine Pilar, and she's basically, at a certain point, the French government, or the French crown in this case, in the 1600s, decides that this whole idea that the French and Indigenous people are going to make one people, it's not working. Indigenous people are rejecting it. Very few Indigenous women actually officially marry French men, and even though there's this idea today that it was very common in New France, it actually wasn't. There were thousands of Indigenous people who lived very close to the French settlers. There were many fewer of them, and there are very few marriages. Literally, we're talking about 10 women, 13 actually before 1680, but less than 10 before 1670. So the French crown decides that what they're going to do is send French women to New France. They're called the filles du roi. Some of you might have heard of them. Some people in English call it the king's daughters. But essentially the crown decides they're going to pay the dowry of young girls, young women who are living in urban centers, often from marginalized families, maybe Protestants, maybe poor families. And they're going to pay them, their families, to accept to send their daughters to New France, where they'll be trained for a little bit by Catholic nuns to be good settler women, so they'll bear children. So most of them get married by the age of 16, some as early as 14. And this starts in 1663. It goes on for just over a decade, and there's about 700 of these women. Katherine Pilar was one of these women. This is why I'm telling you this story. So Katherine Pilar has been recognized as one of these women in sort of French-Canadian history for basically the past several decades. There are books written about these women, and she's one of the women who is often part of those histories. Recently, though, Katherine Pilar became Indigenous, and that's the story I want to tell here. So how does this happen? How does a woman who is born in the 1650s, for whom we have a baptismal record, we have a baptismal record from La Rochelle in France. So this is what this quotation is saying, and I'll read it out in a second. We have a baptismal record with her father's name and her mother's first name, though not last name. We still have that archived today. She's always thought of as French. How does she become Indigenous all of a sudden in 2007? So these researchers here, there's 3 genealogists who write a paper in 2007. They do some research. And there's one thing I'll kind of present here about DNA ancestry testing. It's related to mitochondrial DNA, or what people call mtDNA. Does anyone know what mitochondrial DNA is? Do you want to share? It's a big crowd, I get it. I'm speaking to you at the back, if you'd like. Kind of heard what you said, and I think you were right on. So yeah, basically mitochondrial DNA is DNA that doesn't mutate when it's passed down, and it's passed down from your mother. So both male and females can have that same DNA from their mothers. So what happens is there's a number of research projects, and I'm going to talk about a couple here, where researchers are essentially looking for the descendants of these women in the 1600s who are descended from them through women, all through women. So these are people who are alive today and who know their genealogy and can trace back their relationship, their ancestral relationship with Katherine Pilar through women. So they identify a few, and they decide through this project, they look for volunteers, they identify 3 in fact. And then the way that this sort of research works, DNA ancestry testing, particularly mitochondrial DNA, is that there's a particular, it's called a haplogroup, so a group of DNA that is unique to particular women in the past. Okay, so we're not really going to get into the science of it, but let's just trust that it works for now. I don't generally trust it works, but we'll just do that for now. So these researchers are looking for, essentially, the descendants of Katherine Pilar through women to be able to identify what Katherine Pilar's mitochondrial DNA is, and whether or not that mitochondrial DNA is actually similar or the same as a sample that has been deemed to be Native American DNA. Okay? So this is why these projects exist. It's basically to find out whether or not a number of women in the 1600s are Indigenous or not, because people want them to be, for a variety of reasons that we're going to look into. So in this case, historically, and this is them explaining what the sort of historical consensus is when they go into their research. Historically, there's been little reason to bring Katherine's origins into question. There is a baptismal record for Katherine, daughter of Pierre Pilar and Marguerite, who's her mother, dated March in St. Marguerite Chapel in the parish of Notre Dame de Cun in La Rochelle, France, which is in the western, sort of like almost, I wouldn't say north, but central west part of France, La Rochelle. Even with the collective experience in Native genealogy and history of the researchers involved in this study, they never considered Katherine Pilar a person of interest in any Native American DNA study before today. The authors knew her origin, her parents, and that a baptismal record had been found in recent years. There was no obvious red flag. Now, clearly, part of what this research is doing is looking for those red flags and trying to see them as opportunities to prove definitively that someone perhaps in the past, in the 1600s, is Indigenous or not. Lo and behold, as part of their research, they discover, or at least, as we'll see, they create a new identity for Katherine Pilar. And I'm using this image here because you can see how, in this case, it's actually an Inuk family from Siberia, and we'll see why in a second. So this is the title of the paper. Katherine Pilar, a king's daughter of Algonquin Siberian origin, born in France about 1651. What is wrong with this picture? And then on this website, they put a picture of what I suppose the authors are thinking is some sort of connection to an Algonquin Siberian identity. So the idea of indigeneity circulates quite freely on these websites and through these efforts. So I'm going to read what they sort of explain here. However, and this is their research, recent DNA evidences bring the traditional notion of her origins under serious scrutiny. Current DNA evidence now suggests the strong likelihood of her maternal origins in the Americas, specifically in Quebec, and the virtual impossibility of her originating from France. How did this surprising turn of events come about? Advances in DNA testing, its availability to ordinary individuals, as well as remarkable coincidences led the authors to gather genetic and genealogical evidences about the origins of Katherine Pilar. So through their research, essentially what the authors come up with as a conclusion is that the mitochondrial DNA that their descendants, so Katherine Pilar's descendants have in their DNA sample, is actually comparable to a number of samples that have been taken that are called Algonquin Siberian. So that's why Katherine Pilar becomes Algonquin Siberian through this research. So this idea suddenly that Katherine Pilar is not a woman whose dowry was paid for by the King of France, who came from a poor family, a poor Protestant family, and was basically sent over to Quebec City to bear French children. That's no longer the story. Now we got a different story. And this starts circulating online. So I have a few examples here. Part of what I do in my book is I actually look at a number of genealogical forums. So online forums where individuals often search for Indigenous ancestry or make claims about Indigenous identity. I followed 5 of them quite closely for a period of about 15 years, 3 in English, 2 in French. And here's an example of how after this research in 2007, and still very close to today actually in 2015, an individual has significantly transformed Katherine Pilar's identity. I did recently get some genealogical help and trace my métis line back to Katherine Pilar Pla Wenta Huron. I have been told that this makes me eligible for enrollment in the Métis Federation of Canada, which is one of the organizations that represents quote-unquote Eastern Métis people. And I specifically asked if I can apply for membership as a US citizen. So in this case, you could see that Katherine Pilar is given another last name. So she all of a sudden has a new last name, Pla. And somehow, we're not entirely sure, I'll explain how in a second, she becomes Huron, right? So not only is she Algonquin Siberian in some weird molecular way that we'll get to in a few moments, but she actually becomes a Huron woman. Remember that she's born in the 1650s. Okay, and here's another example. This is from a different site, a different online genealogy forum in 2016. Katherine Pilar, so another name is added, was listed as a fille du roi, remember king's daughters, but her matrilineal DNA was proven to be Native American, and now we know her by birth name Wenta, daughter of the great chief Atsena of the Bear Clan Huron tribe. There's another thread that takes notice, etc., etc. So this is often what happens when a French woman is transformed into an Indigenous woman. Again, it's actually a French woman. Is that to legitimize the claim, they're usually associated or often associated with some male chief or some male figure of great renown, Indigenous figure. So that's what happens here, and it lends the claim some validity, at least, in some of these circles. So there's a family association in Quebec. There are a lot of these because the genealogical records in Quebec are very complete. There's a variety of reasons that we can talk about afterwards if you have questions about that. One of the things to know is that there are about, I call them French descendants like myself, basically white French descendants. There are about 13 to 14 million of us in Canada and the United States. And when I say French descendants, it's people who are related to the first French settlers in New France. Okay, so whether it's in Acadia, current day Nova Scotia, or whether it's in the St. Lawrence Valley in Quebec. The large majority of us have some Indigenous ancestry. A very little amount, usually from the same handful of women in the 1600s. So this is kind of the search in a way, is people are looking to see if they're connected to those individuals, to then use that to claim an Indigenous identity. All right, so where am I going with this? Oh yeah, right. So this family association, they basically are an association that brings together all of the descendants of Katherine Pilar and her husband Pierre Charles. So they have several thousand members who pay, they have a newsletter, and they're kind of intrigued by this claim in 2007. Hey, wait a second, Katherine Pilar is Indigenous? We never considered that as a possibility. And they want to actually independently verify the research of these three genealogists. So they actually set up their own research project. So they have the best known genetic genealogist, so someone who studies DNA ancestry testing and its connection with genealogy, the best known one in Quebec, to rerun the results that these genealogists did. And also they hire a historian in France to go through the records to see if there's a Pilar name in that La Rochelle region at that time. And they also hire a French-Canadian historian to go through all the records in New France for every mention of Katherine Pilar. So they have three different sort of projects. The main one clearly is to look at the DNA ancestry evidence. So this man's name is Jacques Bogano. He's the guy I was saying is the best known DNA ancestry researcher in Quebec, and probably in the Francophone world. So he does this project. It's titled Katherine Pilar's mtDNA, which in French is ADN mitochondrial. And I just translated here his sort of take on this. So basically, he disproves their results. So they had come up with results that her haplogroup, so this is the group basically of specific DNA related to, in this case, Katherine Pilar, was from Eastern Siberia. So that kind of fits the idea that's out there that Indigenous peoples went over this land bridge, right? So that was why Eastern Siberia, those people end up becoming Indigenous to the Americas and become Algonquin. So it kind of fit with this evolutionary story that we have, which often DNA is trying to do. He actually explains that if they had done their research well, they would have seen that it's not X2, but it's X10. What's the difference? Oh, about 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers across Asia. So instead of being in Eastern Siberia, he's saying that this DNA actually comes from Western Asia, very close to Europe, in a region of Europe between the Black Sea and the, I'm forgetting the other sea, but basically just on the edges of current-day Turkey. And if you know your history from basically the medieval period, you know that those people actually invaded Western Europe several times. So he actually comes up with different results that suggest that, in fact, Pilar has French DNA that comes from Western Europe into, Eastern Asia, Western Asia, into Western Europe at a particular point in time, around the same time as the land bridge. So it's a different story, same DNA, by someone who has experience doing this type of testing versus three people who didn't and simply just didn't have the tools to go as in depth as this researcher did. So he's saying, of course, here that these researchers fueled this, this controversy around Pilar's identity. There was actually no reason to if they had done their research well. This is an academic slapdown. You may not recognize it as such, but had they been more rigorous, very polite, but no doubt there's some shade here. So online, on these forums, this kind of circulates, but of course, what ends up happening, actually before I get to that, I'll show you a response. So this was the online sort of newsletter that published the translation that made Katherine Pilar Algonquin Siberian. So they basically put a retraction. the researcher has been following the research. This one here, her name is Susan Colby, and she publishes in there that, in fact, Katherine Pilar seems to be European, and this is the way that she makes sense of that. In any case, this latest report out of Russia clearly shows a West Siberian origin for a European ancestor, rather than an eastern trek across the Bering Straits for a Native American ancestor. As much as we, her descendants, I'm also one of her descendants, there are probably some of you in this room too, hope for Native American roots, the mitochondrial DNA still reveals an exotic heritage for Katherine Pilar to capture our imaginations. I, for one, choose to see our many greats grandmother as a black-haired beauty settling into the Italian Alps with her younger daughter as her eldest daughter and the Huns press on to France. So this idea of there, basically a search for some sort of exoticism is maintained here. In this case, from the Huns, basically Western Asian people. And as this study by Bogano comes out in 2009, and moving forward, there's more and more evidence that this X10 ends up in Western Europe. So it ends up in the Alps, which is why she says this here. And then there are other testing that's been done in Western Europe where they find this X10, which simply confirms more, at least in terms of this research, that Pilar is in fact French. So, all right. So this is the family association. This is their image here of what they imagine Katherine Pilar looked like. Their website, they sort of have an ongoing update on all the controversy around her identity. And they end up coming out with this statement: the uncertainty about the origin of Katherine Pilar has caused a widespread questioning in our association. We believe that the conclusions we have reached strike an appropriate balance about everything we know concerning Katherine Pilar, whether from a genetics or genealogical perspective, et cetera, et cetera. They kind of leave the door open that maybe one day we'll find out more and she will return to being Indigenous, which is kind of the work of DNA ancestry testing for the most part, right? So I just wanted to update you also that the French historian goes into the records from the late 1500s, early 1600s in the La Rochelle region, identifies a number of people with the Pilar last name. And then the French-Canadian historian goes through all these records in New France, finds 50 mentions of Katherine Pilar in church registers. Sometimes she was someone's godmother, sometimes she was a witness to something, a wedding, a baptism. And every time her name is written, Katherine Pilar. So this idea that somehow her name was Pilar or Pilar, and that made her the daughter of some great chief, is also debunked through that research. So all the research suggests that she is who we always thought she was, and is not an Algonquin Siberian woman. Of course, that hasn't stopped people from using Pilar as the basis for their Indigenous identity. And that's some of what I wanted to explain here. So I have the records of 2,000 membership records from this organization called the Communauté Métis Autochtone de Maniwaki. So they're one of the primary groups in Quebec who's sort of claiming this quote-unquote Quebec Métis or Eastern Métis identity. And they submitted these genealogies as part of their court case, one that's ongoing today. So I've blacked out, redacted the person's name, but this is the type of document that one submits to become a member of this quote-unquote Métis organization. What you do is you trace one of your lines. Some people have 3 or 4 lines, for instance. This person has one that leads you to Katherine Pilar in this case. Katherine Pilar is your quote-unquote Indigenous root ancestor, which means that for the purpose of this organization, you are Métis, with no Indigenous ancestry whatsoever. Here's another person, another one. I can keep going, because there are literally dozens of people in this organization who use Katherine Pilar. Actually, there are several hundred of those records I've seen who use her as their sole Indigenous root ancestor. And of course, we know that she's French. So in these organizations in Quebec, I've seen over 5,000 records, and also in New England, in New Hampshire, and Vermont, there are literally thousands of people who are saying that they're Indigenous today who have 0 Indigenous ancestry. Because Pilar was only one of several French women who are remade into Indigenous women for the purpose of this movement. And you can see here that just in terms of the evidence, there's a number of generations skipped, so we don't even really know if the person's connected, even though we know that she's French. So it goes from 6 to 12, for instance. And these are the actual records that they presented in court as evidence of their identity, right? So these are the most definitive, one would assume, records that they have. One last one here. Okay. The second example. So I gave you one example, Katherine Pilar. The second one, it actually involves 2 sisters, Edmé and Catherine Lejeune, who are Acadian women. They're born in the 1630s in Nova Scotia. They're Acadian women, and something similar to Katherine Pilar happens. And I just want to say that I found out about all this not through my own genealogy, which I did for this book that I'm publishing, but more on the genealogical forums, because there's a lot of controversy about this. So there's actually pushback. Some people are genealogists and they're like, hey, that's not actually an Indigenous person. So through that, I got to see that there are a number of women who are transformed into Indigenous. Some people don't believe they are. Some people want to believe they are. But this is an example of that. So on this one genealogy forum, this person posts this table here, and I'll explain what's going on. So Catherine Lejeune, let's see here. The story is quite fascinating. It involves, of course, a woman who is connected to a great chief. So in this case, the great chief is a Mi'kmaq chief called Member Two. Right? So Member Two, some of you might know this history, meets the French fairly early on, before the 1600s. Essentially, a lot of Basque fishermen and other French fishermen would come to the shore. And Member Two is sort of a historical figure that people mention a lot. So in this story, Member Two marries a woman, here you can see mother, Mary Abenaki, so an Abenaki woman, who's born in 1582. They have a daughter who they end up sending to France, kind of as a sort of like a gift, a sign of goodwill to the French. You know, we'll take some of your people, you take some of ours, and you know, it'll bring us closer together, at least the story goes. And that woman lives in France, according to the story, marries a Frenchman, has children, and Katherine Pilar was one of those children. Sorry, that came out wrong. So, it's not Katherine Pilar, sorry, Katherine Lejeune and Edmé Lejeune. So they somehow get this sort of connection to this Mi'kmaq chief. If you look, though, at this, what's really interesting and is telling, because this is the type of thing you'll find online and people will rely on to make their claim to a specific identity today, an Indigenous identity, is that the mother is born in 1582 and the daughter is born in 1585. I don't know about you, but
Wow.
that seems unlikely. So this was used as evidence, like, look, here, the story's here, and of course, it's not possible, and this story isn't true. It's simply not true. There are records about the Lejeune sisters. Their brother marries a Mi'kmaq woman. That's true, in the 1650s, but neither of them do. I'm also related to Katherine Lejeune, as are literally hundreds of thousands of French descendants today. Same thing with Katherine Pilar. And so I'm just another example of the DNA Ancestry project. It's called the Mothers of Acadia Mitochondrial DNA Project, as you can see. It's done through it's ancestry.com. But in any case, so these researchers team up with Ancestry DNA companies who charge fees to, basically provide research for these projects. So they make quite a bit of money doing it. And it's the same as what I was explaining earlier. They're trying to identify the mitochondrial DNA of every single Acadian woman or Mi'kmaq woman who's married to an Acadian man in the 1600s. So that's basically what this project is about. And they've managed to find the mitochondrial DNA for over 80% of them. So quite a few. Obviously, two of them are the Lejeune sisters, and they found many, many descendants through women. Like many, many. I think they have results for over 30. And I just wanted to give you, this is what the results look like. I'm not going to get into too many details. What's most important is that they are identified as having this mitochondrial DNA, so they're descendants today, and also them, because of that connection, U6A, which basically confirms, according to this logic, that they're European. So both of them, you can see over and over again, there's literally pages of results for both of them because they have so many descendants today, and thus so many volunteers who wanted to take part in this research. If you go to this website, you'll see that there's dozens and dozens of women who have the exact same sort of results. Almost all of them are confirmed as European. Of course, even though there's the funny thing, I guess, when it comes to the Lejeune sisters is that this happens before DNA technology is sort of around. When it comes to a lot of Acadian women in the 1600s, we know that men write history. They hardly ever write about women. If they do, it's not in ways that are very complimentary. There's not much written about a number of Acadian women prior to like 1680, 1690. So before this movement and also before the sort of advent of DNA ancestry testing, if we didn't know much about French women at that time, they just sort of automatically became Mi'kmaq in these circles. even though there's a bunch of researchers who would suggest they're not, historians. So this is kind of what happened with the Lejeune sisters. So it's only afterwards that the DNA Ancestry comes and says, actually, they're not. They're French women. But people continue to use them as their indigenous, quote-unquote, root ancestor, of course. So these are records from the same organization. And you can see here that this individual is using Katherine Lejeune, who is 13 generations away from them, as their indigenous root ancestor, and joining a quote-unquote métis organization accordingly. This person here is using Edmé, Katherine's sister, again 13 generations away as their indigenous root ancestor, and this person is using Katherine as well, 12 generations away. Katherine is 14 generations away from them. Okay, so I want to talk about those two examples. One involves two people, two sisters, one involves one woman, of how French women in the past are being reclaimed, or actually remade into indigenous women for the purpose of this movement. That's really come on, and I'll explain a little bit more about when it sort of comes about. There's one thing I wanted to say that I forgot. What I'll do now, I'm going to shift away from the genealogical side of things. When I go through those 5,000 records, what I've found is that about 30% of individuals whose records I've seen are claiming an quote-unquote indigenous identity who have no indigenous ancestry. 80% of the people whose files I've seen or whose records I've seen are claiming it on the basis of a woman, an indigenous woman. No, actually, I'm combining both. So are claiming it on the basis of an ancestor in the 1600s. So that includes some who are French and obviously some who are indigenous as well. So 80% are relying on someone in the 1600s to say they're indigenous today, which is against the widespread scholarly consensus among indigenous scholars in particular when it comes to indigenous identity and belonging. It's not based on blood. It's certainly not based on an ancestor 12, 13, 10 generations ago. So we see that there's a large amount of people, thousands of people today who are part of this movement who have no indigenous ancestry, and then people like me, I have 3 Algonquin ancestors, all women in the 1600s, all born before 1670. That certainly doesn't make me indigenous, it certainly doesn't make me métis. And my message and my research is basically to other white people like me who are making these claims. So we're going to look at some of the organizations, just so I could, I don't know, give you a sense of what's happening. So this is going to be a website soon. It's not right now, so it's kind of a not so great. Let's see if I can, it's a bit smaller. Not so great Google Doc. But so I've basically surveyed or counted about 50 currently operating organizations in Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. That's basically my limit. So I'll show you a map of this in a moment. But if you're interested in seeing this, I post it quite regularly on Twitter. But I'm more than happy to share it with you if your instructor would like to get it. I could do that. So basically, I document the organization, when their origins are, court cases that they've been involved in, which I'll get to in a second. So one really interesting thing, or I don't know, troubling, depends, I suppose, how you feel about this, is, I'm just going to go down to the US-based organizations, because to me that's something quite striking. All right. So yeah, the same women. There are 4 of them that I highlight in my book. So each of them are used for very different identities today. So in one case, there's a woman named Marie Sylvestre. She's born in the late 1620s. She gets married in 1644 to a Frenchman. And she has, according to my calculation, upwards of 850,000 descendants today. So she's the one who's used the most in those records I have. About 25% of the people who are saying that they're indigenous are saying it on the basis only of an ancestry with her. But they're not just saying they're Métis in Quebec, they're also saying that they're Abenaki in New Hampshire and Vermont, and Algonquin in Ontario, on the basis of her. So there are these ways that the same woman will be used for very different identities and very different political purposes in different places, depending on whatever context it's in. So I've seen that for 4 different women. Clearly, Marie Sylvestre was not Métis, Algonquin, and Abenaki. If that's not clear, I can answer some questions about that. So here's just some examples of some quote-unquote tribes in New England that have taken on this new identity of Abenaki, many of whom rely on Katherine Pilar, for instance, as root ancestors, or this one, métis. I will go here. This is the map. So this is a website that we're currently developing that's almost ready to be released publicly. So you can see here the blue push pins are currently active organizations. The red push pins are organizations that were active and aren't anymore. Oftentimes what they do is they merge with a bigger organization. And then the stars, which are only in New Brunswick, because New Brunswick is that kind of place, are court cases. So we're going to have all the court cases as well for this whole region. And by court cases, I mean cases that involve people making a claim to being métis in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec. So they're looking to be recognized as métis under the Pauli test, which is basically a Supreme Court of Canada case that was decided in 2003 that recognized that the métis have Aboriginal rights under the Constitution Act of 1982 under Section 35, which maybe you'll discuss in this class, but maybe not. You can look it up. What the Pauli decision does is it sets up a test, so criteria for how to define who's métis. I'm not suggesting that courts should do that. I think the métis people should do that when it comes to defining who's part of the community. So I'm not supportive of courts doing that, and I'm not saying, look, they keep failing in court, therefore they're not métis. I look at the court cases more for what their arguments are about who they are, what types of evidence that they bring in. Regardless, though, so once this decision happens in 2003, this is really when this movement takes a lot of I'm thinking of the French word, but gets really big. So that's what I've been able to demonstrate by looking at the origins of the organizations, and if you look at the court cases, that's similar as well. So once the Pauli test is something that exists out there, a bunch of individuals try to access Aboriginal rights, often to put a stop to Aboriginal people's territorial agreements with governments. So they try to intervene, they file injunctions as new Aboriginal people, and there's a very cynical political motivation, and I know this because I've looked at the records and what they've said publicly at those periods of time and in interviews that they did for their court cases. So that's something that I did recently. So for instance, when this website is released, you'll be able to click here and look at the case number, and it'll give you all kinds of information about what the case was about, what organization was involved, etc. So there are about, oh, actually, that's the other thing I'm going to show you. But I really like the map, so I'm going to show one more time. And the green push pins are national organizations, so they kind of like represent a bunch of smaller ones, also on this idea that they're representing Eastern Métis people. So I can come back to this if you have questions about the map or you want me to zone in on something specifically. This is a list of the court cases and decisions that I just created last week, actually, sort of for you all, but I think it might be getting used a little bit more widely. So I have New Brunswick and Quebec and Nova Scotia, those three provinces. Let's just go down. Obviously, when there's a case, you could have many decisions in the same case. So lower court decision followed by another decision, then a court of appeal, for instance. So there's a lot of decisions. There's more decisions than cases, which seems a bit counterintuitive. But for instance, in New Brunswick, there have been 26 decisions involving 17 individuals between 2001. So they actually started using the lower court Pauli decision in 2001 and up until 2015. And in the records and in the case, they often will say who their Indigenous ancestor is. So I followed those. There are 16 ancestors who are listed for the 17 people, and the average ancestral depth of those ancestors is 10.5 generations. So on average, the people in these court cases are claiming an ancestor who's born at the end of the 1600s as their root ancestor, and really their only connection to indigeneity. At least 8 of the 14 individuals involved in these cases in New Brunswick have 0 Indigenous ancestry. So more than half of them have none. Who are they claiming? Let's go see. So, surprise, surprise, Edmé Lejeune is claimed by these 5 people as their only root ancestor. We just saw who Edmé is. Edmé Lejeune, Catherine Lejeune, and Radejon Lambert. I'm also related to Radejon. It's a great name. Thank you. I try to be humorous, sometimes falls flat. In any case, so these three, Radejon is also one of these women who's French, who somehow becomes Indigenous. So in this case, this guy claims three French women as his quote-unquote Indigenous root ancestors. And then Radejon comes back here. Yeah, so you can see it's basically the same Acadian women, mostly French. There are a couple here who I didn't actually include as non-Indigenous, who are most likely French. You know, I just didn't have time to do research on every single ancestor, but there are some that clearly their claims to indigeneity about a past person is also questionable. So if we look at Quebec, there's been a lot more cases in Quebec, but they start a little bit later. I can explain why if you want, and someone wants to ask me about that. But essentially, the first case that's filed is in 2007, but almost all of the cases in Quebec have happened since 2014, and there are lots of them. In the past 4 months, I have had decisions sent to me, in the past 2 months, I've had 4 decisions sent to me, and there's many ongoing cases in Quebec. It's definitely the most active site right now for court cases. So I'm just gonna go down. Here, for instance, in this case, you can see that Catherine Lejeune is reclaimed as an ancestor for these folks in the Saguenay region, which is on the other side of the north. It's on the north shore of the St. Lawrence, sort of like up downstream from Quebec City. So there are a bunch of Acadians who end up in that region. That's how I'm related to Acadians, and that's how Pierre Trudeau, not Pierre, well, Pierre and Justin. I always say Pierre, but I mean Justin. That's what happens when you got a monarchy, I mean democracy. So those Trudeaus are also related to Catherine Lejeune, and we have the same family who end up going to Quebec, a brother and a sister. So I'm related to the sister, he's related to the brother. They fled the Acadian deportation at the same time, went to Quebec. So a lot of Acadians end up in Quebec because they're fleeing basically the British, exiling them, sending them away, ethnic cleansing. So we're related to a brother and sister, me and the Trudeaus. So we see eye to eye on everything. All right, so if we go down, there are 50 decisions in Quebec involving 43 individuals, so again, quite a bit more. And the ancestral depth, average ancestral depth is 9.6 generations, so a little bit more recent, basically like born around 1710 is the root ancestor average for people here who are making these claims. And at least 6 of them out of the 36 have no Indigenous ancestry. So if we look overall, there's only 2 cases in Nova Scotia, but I know of 2 that were recently filed, including a land claim by one of these quote-unquote métis groups. So at least 28% of the individuals who've been involved in these court cases have 0 Indigenous ancestry, and that's at least, right? So it could be more. Again, I haven't checked every single individual who's claimed as an ancestor, and sometimes they're not named. So the judge will be like, I recognize that you have an ancestor 9 generations ago, but they don't say who, and I don't have all the case files for every single court case. Okay, right, one last thing. So if we do the average of them all, they're about 10 generations away, the Indigenous root ancestors. And that's what's making these folks claim to be quote-unquote métis. I have more Indigenous ancestry than almost all of the people who are claiming to be quote-unquote métis in these court cases. Because most of them are relying on one person in the 1600s. And this is the website that we're releasing soon as well. So the website is going to have the story map, which I just showed you, and it'll have information about all the court cases. Whoops. This is why it's not released yet. Close your eyes. Yeah, so you can click on it, it'll show you where it is. So we're trying, basically, me and some of the people I'm working with, to make this data available as widely as possible, not just my analysis. I have an analysis. The data is sort of like the material that you analyze. Just trying to make it kind of available as widely as possible for people who are interested in finding out more about this, but in particular, community members who are dealing with sort of the sudden increase in the number of people who are claiming to be Indigenous, particularly out east. And I think I'm just going to end right there.
Amen.
So we have time for questions, but I invite you to ask Darryl Leroux any questions you may have.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your talk. I guess I have a big picture kind of silhouette in your ears
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
So in this last time between my student and
What do you read?
Traders. Leanne Simpson's Newish Library, as we've always done.
I think you have to speak up a little bit.
We are reading Leanne Simpson's book, as we have always done.
Yes.
And a student asked a really good question because the book is very much directed to an Indigenous audience, and it is, you know, it's like, this is how Indigenous people can reclaim, research, do all the things. And the student said, you know, non-Indigenous people shouldn't go and be on the land. You know, like, this is not a way to be a good settler, I suppose. And I feel like your copy is like, this is not a good way to be a good settler.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm curious about what are the political implications of your work? What do you hope that people do, and how can non-Indigenous people actually support efforts towards decolonization, if not to claim the various Katrines?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that because I'm kind of talking to people who are making this move. I have people in my family who've done this, you know, who made a variety of really strange claims to being Métis and got a card from an organization, like 2 uncles and a cousin, who had, you know, motivations that were, in my mind, extremely problematic. So I didn't really talk very clearly about, I guess, some very direct political implications, because I was focusing more on the mechanics of how it works. And I kind of, yeah. So I kind of struggle between doing one or the other. Because if I talk about the politics, and it's like, but how are they doing that? And so the politics of it, I wrote an article, this one here, Self-Made Métis. If you haven't read it, go for it if you'd like. It's quite long. It's in a magazine, though. It's got a really neat image and some, you know, magazine type stuff. Essentially what I outline in there is I look at the two main organizations in Quebec and how they came about. In the first one, in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean-Côte-Nord, 2 regions of Quebec that are in Innu territory, the organization basically takes off. First, it's a group of people, almost all men, who are upset that there is a land claim negotiation between the two levels of government and the Innu. Okay, 3 communities. There are a bunch of Innu people who are against the land claim, for very different reasons than the white folks in the region. One of them founds the Association for White Rights, which gets 3,000 members within a year. And Paoli happens, all of these people who are anti-Indigenous, who are really using this Islamophobic, anti-Indigenous language, bringing it together. This guy starts calling the Innu the Red Taliban, for instance. They start claiming to be Métis as a political strategy. So in the actual interviews that I've seen with these people that they've conducted for a court case, where they had a friendly anthropologist who sits down with them and says, tell us about your oral history, they are very clear that the reason they exist is to put a stop to the land claim negotiations. And that is the only reason that they're calling themselves Métis. So that's a very clear political implication. If people don't know about that, and either they're joining those organizations or they're seeing this organization as a legitimate organization, which often they are, whether that's institutions or institutions don't know how to handle this. Recently I had a friend who works in a Department of Native Studies who was on a committee, and there was a student from that community who was applying to go to medical school as an Aboriginal student. Right? And literally that organization started as a white rights organization. And then its membership became Métis almost overnight. There's no trace of those organizations once the Métis organization is founded. They have 5,000 members today. They just went to the Quebec Court of Appeal and lost, and they're waiting to hear about whether or not the Supreme Court of Canada is going to hear their appeal. And it's been 3 months, which is a long time for the Supreme Court to wait. It's actually almost been 4 months. So we're not sure if they're going to hear the appeal. If they do, I have a lot of really great records for them to look at. The other one is in Gaspésie and Mi'kmaq territory, so across the St. Lawrence. Very similar story, not quite as explicitly white rights, but 9 hunters are very upset because there's this territorial agreement between this Mi'kmaq community, Giscabéguiag, and the provincial government to set up basically a territory that Giscabéguiag would set up to have hunting and fishing expeditions, guides. In Quebec, they're called pourvoiries, but they're essentially like outfitting territories. So they're going to have horseback riding, camping, hunting, fishing. They're going to have like Mi'kmaq guides, all of this. They figure it'll create about 20 full-time jobs. They're quite happy about it because they'll reconnect with the part of Mi'kmaq land that they haven't been connecting with. These hunters rise up. They form a hunting rights association because they're on that specific territory where they could stay. They'd have to pay a fee, or they could just go down the street and hunt somewhere else. And that's what the Mi'kmaq tell them. Of course, within a year of Paoli happening, these people start saying they're Métis. Today they have a 20,000 strong Métis Nation of the Rising Sun is what it's called. And the agreement never happens. Not only because of their opposition, but certainly that opposition played a large role in the failure of this territorial agreement. So those are some of the things I didn't talk about that the last 2 chapters of my book specifically address, and this magazine article are entirely about. And I go through the interviews and the testimony to give in court where they explain this quite openly. Why? I don't know. But if you were to talk to them today, in terms of the language they use, they've completely co-opted the language of decolonization. They've completely, they use this idea that their ancestors had to hide in plain sight, that they were discriminated against, which Adam Gaudry and I talk about in this article we wrote in 2017. But they use these discourses that appeal to people on an emotional level. And really what they are white people who have opposed Indigenous people and were looking for a political strategy to do so. Thanks for the question. Yes.
So, that if somebody asked, why are these things cropping up so recently in Quebec?
Well, my explanation for that, I came into this because I study racism and colonialism in Quebec and in French Canada. Whoops. Oh, look, there's and so I kind of came to this research through that kind of angle. And my explanation is that it's linked to a particular, it's not just the court decision. Clearly it's something that, if you look in the French language, there's a long history of thinking that the French were much kinder and friendlier to Indigenous people and that we're very close with them. And this whole idea is quite common in literature, in films. There's a number of documentaries that have come out in the past few years that basically make the claim that all Quebecers are Indigenous, or at least a lot of cultural practices in Quebec are at their base from Indigenous people. So this discourse circulates quite widely. I think that the Pauli decision provided a particular political and legal strategy to actually be like, well, we're going to stop just talking about it in romantic terms, in terms that are more discursive, like in terms that are not, we're not saying we're Indigenous, we're just saying we get along better. We're actually going to start saying we're Indigenous. And that's certainly something that's happened in the past decade and a half. And you see it across all kinds of different sites. So I've looked at the political dimension of it, so the formation of these organizations, them going to courts, them, their relationship with Indigenous peoples, which are non-existent or completely hostile in my experience of researching this. So yeah, I think that's what's changed, the claim to an Indigenous identity. And just to give an example of the sort of breadth of it, I guess, if we look at census data, I'll give Nova Scotia as an example. In 1996, there were 860 people in Nova Scotia who ticked off Métis identity. So 860, many of whom are probably Acadians, who for whatever reason thought about being Métis related to some Mi'kmaq person in the 1600s. Some who are legitimately Métis people who live in Nova Scotia. I know some of them, they exist. And then in 2016, there were over 23,000. Right? So we go from 860 to 23,315, which is an increase of over 28 times in 20 years. So often it's people who, it's not like someone asked me once, is that because there's been a birth boom? No. That doesn't happen in 20 years, right? This is adults for the most part who are claiming a new identity. In sociology, it's called ethnic mobility. I use the term race shifting because it's a term that Sergey Stern, who's an anthropologist in the United States, uses to explain the whole phenomenon of self-identified Cherokee tribes and people in the United States. So there's something similar that's happening in the United States. Instead of saying Métis, they generally call themselves Cherokee. There's this whole thing about the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother who's a Cherokee or something like that. It's kind of like this joke in some ways. But Elizabeth Warren has made that pretty clear, right? So she actually claimed to be Indigenous on her application for a job not too long ago because there's this story that's been circulating in her family, which is not unlike what happens with French descendants. So many of us have this story in the family, and sometimes, it's really about, not sometimes, almost all the time, it's about an ancestor in the 1600s, because genealogical records have been widely available in French Canada for 150 years. right? There are like encyclopedias that you can go to a library and access that will give you your ancestry going back to the 1600s, more or less. Literally huge documents. I don't know where I was going, but. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I've been seeing recently in the news a lot of stories about sort of the unreliability of those sort of DNA tests that you
Yeah.
send in. Like people finding out identical twins have different origins, or people finding out that they share an ancestor with their dog. So I'm kind of wondering how that sort of unreliability might fit into what you're doing.
Mhm. Yeah, that's why at the beginning, I guess I just said, let's just take them at face value. And I didn't really talk about this too much, but my work is building on the work of Alondra Nelson in the United States, who does work, a sociologist who does work on sort of DNA ancestry testing, and also Kim Tallbear, who's at the University of Alberta, and wrote a book called Native American DNA, which is great. And both of them, question the validity and all that, but mostly look at why people want to find things out about who they are and what they want to find out about who they are. And one of the things that's really stuck with me about Alondra Nelson, and her research is a different context because it's about African Americans in the United States. And there's a couple ancestry companies that specifically target African Americans to find their sort of tribal origins in Africa, which you can't do, right? But so she sees it as something, she's very sympathetic to that. When you've been violently taken from your land, people want to know where they come from, and that's totally legitimate. But what she explains is that there's a way in which people use DNA ancestry testing to confirm what they want to believe, right? And that's what I'm seeing in my research. So regardless of whether Katherine Pilar or Catherine Lejeune and Edmé Lejeune are proven, quote unquote, to be European or Indigenous, people are already looking for what confirms what they want. So that's why I titled this Kinship Aspirations. Like, people want to be able to name an ancestor in a certain way so they can make a claim about their identity today. And that's one of the things that I learned from Alondra Nelson's work. So regardless of that question, which I'll get to in a second, I think it's important to think about that social and political context, that people aren't necessarily engaging with the technologies because they want the facts. They're engaging with the technologies because they want to confirm what they believe about themselves in many ways. There are different types of DNA ancestry testing. The one that most people probably see is the one where it's like, you're 10% African, 80% European, 3% Native American. You know those ones? Those are autosomal DNA, which is like a whole other beast. Those things are very user beware in a lot of ways. One thing to keep in mind is that if you're saying that someone is X, you need to have a sample of X. So that's often what is brought up as one of the problems, is that there are very few samples of people across Africa. So there are just a few samples. Africans have, especially in East Africa, have the largest amount of DNA diversity, because if that's where we start, which I agree with in terms of the idea of evolution, then some people leave, they only take a little part of the DNA. The diversity of the DNA stays where it is, right? So East Africans have the most diverse amount of DNA, so to say that a specific sample represents all of Africa is very misleading. And they just don't have enough samples. It's not where researchers go. Same thing with Native American DNA. It's a product. It's been commercialized in particular ways, but it doesn't actually prove anything about people's identity. I think that's the most important thing, especially these types of tests that give you a percentage of that. Recently, you brought up a dog, so I will go there. There's a company called Acumetrics. They're based in Toronto and also in the US. And they had a really brilliant scheme. It was called the Native American, First Nations, and Métis Ancestry product, or Ancestry, I forget exactly. But it was a product. Essentially, you could buy a test, and they would test you for your tribal origins. They said that they could test for 580 tribal origins in Canada, the United States, and 35 in Mexico. And so I took the test twice as part of my research in my book, and write about it briefly at the end of my book. But what that company also did is they teamed up with some of these organizations, not all of them, in Quebec and also further east, to sort of lend credence to their claims of being Indigenous. So for instance, I've written about this one organization that didn't exist prior to the testing of that organization, of that company. And then a number of others have turned to them for this evidence that they're Native American. Now, like I said earlier, there's no test that could test your tribal origins because there just aren't those samples. It's impossible, and because tribal origins would be way too diverse. You know, there isn't like a specific DNA marker for a tribe, because tribes have moved and they've been mobile and they've mixed, right? So that just that won't exist. But they still sell it. One of these organizations, it's been in the news quite a bit recently. Their leader had a partnership. So he's been the grand chief. People have to stand when he enters the room. He wears this massive headdress. He's a very problematic figure in a number of ways. But he had a partnership with this organization. He charges members $250. He'd take half. The company would take half, and then they would test for Native American DNA, and everyone would come back positive because that's the scheme, right? So one of the people who was testing members, who was part of this organization, was like, "This is kind of fishy." And then another one, and CBC kind of found this out by doing research. It was on the National last year. Another one was doing the same thing, kind of asking, like, "This is kind of fishy." They both tested their dogs. One was Molly, and it was a French poodle. And the other was a Chihuahua whose name I'm forgetting. I want to say Bowser, but I think that's probably wrong for Chihuahua. But who knows? Like, people like being ironic these days. So they test their dogs. They send it off with the other samples. Their dogs come back 20% Native American DNA, 12% Abenaki, 8% Mohawk. So CBC's like, this is really weird. So they test 3 people in their newsroom, 2 who are born in India, 1 who's born in Russia, and they come back with the same results. So after that, they asked to interview the president and CEO of the company. He refuses, and the product is taken down from their website. But back to the question about political implications, there literally are organizations who are representing Eastern Métis people who exist only on the strength of those tests. So they're a bad company, as an example. Not many other companies were doing this tribal origin stuff, but the thing to keep in mind is that the companies have their own like algorithm on how because they all have different samples. They're patented. They have an algorithm that they don't share with the public. So you're not able to replicate the results. You don't know how they come up with the results. Only the people inside the company do, and they all use different algorithms and different samples. Other questions? Yes?
Is there a way that we can help hold politicians, for example, accountable for claiming individually? Like, who can we contact to help our cause against people like that? To try to get that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right now, when it comes to these claims to being Eastern Métis, all levels of government, and like we saw, all the courts have denied that, and the Indigenous people out east have also been like, we don't recognize their claims. In fact, recently, the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, also known as the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, signed a memorandum of understanding with the Métis National Council to work together on basically pushing back to these claims in Nova Scotia around there being a Métis people there. So there's some interesting sort of partnerships that are happening on a more bigger political level. I would say that the sort of success that these organizations and individuals have had have mostly been institutional. So at universities, school boards, health authorities, where they're often like the Aboriginal advisors, they're on the Aboriginal kind of education councils or advisory councils. I've seen many examples of that. And I think that universities need to develop policies around these issues. Like, there are clearly many of these organizations that are just plain out fraudulent. And I don't even mean all of the organizations I'm talking about. I'm sure that some Indigenous people some Indigenous people in this territory might recognize as such are part of some of these organizations, but the large majority of them are people like me who aren't Indigenous. So I think institutions need to be aware of this and need Indigenous people but it just creates more work for Indigenous people. That's kind of one of the problems. The people I know who are Indigenous who work at universities are overworked and have way too many committee meetings, sadly. So I guess other white folks need to figure some of this stuff out and pay attention to these types of claims. And I mean, I encourage people like me to have these difficult conversations with family members. I know like a lot of people have reached out to me who are like, my uncle's the president of this organization. What do I do? Well, I don't know. You have uncomfortable conversations. And you do it again and again with other family members, and you stop them from joining. I don't know. There's no easy solution, I don't think. I'm sorry if I'm evading the question.
So we have time for about one more quick question before the other class starts to come in. So,
And there are some flyers here for the book that the awesome people at the University of Manitoba Press, many are in the stands here brought, so if you want information, it's there. It's going to be published in September. Yeah.
In your view, what risk do these kinds of organizations pose to like legitimate Métis Nation organizations?
Well, I mean, I live out east, so I think the politics are different than, west of Ontario, in terms of like how people understand what is Métis. And it's not just, some people will say that it's a linguistic thing, because in French, Métis means mixed race. But like these organizations aren't claiming to be mixed race, they're claiming to be a distinct Indigenous people under the Constitution. So they're using the confusion in some ways. But I mean, there are, like I said, these organizations are making quite a bit of headway in institutions. And I think that undermines Métis peoplehood in all kinds of different ways. But for the Métis people I've spoken to who live in Halifax, for instance, it does create a lot of tension with Mi'kmaq people who are clearly opposed to there being any other rights-bearing Indigenous people in the territory, in the sense of like there is no Nova Scotia Métis population. They're very clear about that on all kinds of different levels. So when people are like, hey, I'm Métis, it's kind of like, yes. And so it does definitely create boundaries among Indigenous people in terms of the solidarity that can be built. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions.